Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Elena Ionescu, and I am the Director of Sustainability at the Specialty Coffee Association of America. This is the second of these webinars that I have hosted on issues that have been identified by various people in the coffee community, myself, the Sustainability Council at the SCAA, as critical issues that we should be talking more about. So today we're going to take an hour and talk about farm workers and farm labor and hopefully learn a little bit about why this is an issue, what it is that we need to know, and take your questions also. So I am here with Quinn Kepes, who's a program director at Verité, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second, and Juan Barrios, who is a coffee producer from Guatemala. One of his farms is Finca Merced. He's also on the board of directors of the SCAA, just you know, for the sake of clarity, and a former member of the board of directors of Ionescu. So we've got a couple perspectives represented, and this is not an area where I feel like I actually have a ton of expertise to lend to this, so I'm hoping that I can ask questions that maybe you as audience members would also want to ask, but I am also going to encourage you to tweet your questions at us. So if you tweet with the hashtag #MakeCoffeeBetter, all one word, then we will answer those questions. Also, you can tweet at the SCAA with the handle @SpecialtyCoffee, and we'll respond to those as well. So anytime during the next hour, you don't have to wait for me to call on you or anything, because I won't be able to do that. Tweet at us, and I'll get your questions to Quinn and to Juan Luis. So before I jump into the questions that I have for these two, I wanted to just frame a little bit of why this is an issue and why we're talking about it today. Because on the one hand, this is an issue that is like not unique to coffee at all. You know, all global agriculture relies on someone to pick whatever the product is and get it to market. That's the first stage in many ways in this supply chain or the value chain. And then it's also an issue that has been around forever. You know, a coffee producer, and I'll ask Juan Luis to talk about this. Coffee producers have identified labor as a challenge for forever. You know, it's difficult to find people, especially when you want the product to be picked well. If you're looking for a certain level of quality, it's hard to find people to do that. And coffee is incredibly labor intensive to pick and produce. It's not something that is done mechanically in most of the countries of the world that produce coffee. So it's a huge percentage of many farms' cost to produce coffee goes into the hand labor of coffee. So this is an issue that farmers have known about forever, but that I feel like is just kind of recently dawning on people on my end of the chain, or coffee buyers who have spent the past decade really looking at the role of the coffee farmer and trying to elevate that and bring the coffee farmer more into the public awareness. But I think in most cases it's kind of stopped there. Like it gets to the farmer and we feel like, cool, we've brought the voice of the farmer, the position of the farmer into the consciousness of the consumer, like we've done our job, and then the farmer takes care of the rest of it. So by talking about this today and over the past couple of months and years, it's just become increasingly, I guess, important, or it's become increasingly clear that we need to also think about farm workers, not just as farmers, but as anyone who cares about coffee. And then, a final thing that I'll say about talking about this issue today in this webinar is that the first webinar we had was on climate change, and I feel like in many ways climate change is an issue that everyone knows about. We've all heard about climate change. We know it's affecting us, but we don't necessarily know like on sort of what horizon it's affecting us. So for some farms, you might feel the effects today, but most of the effects of climate change are things that are projected in the longer term future. So it's a huge issue and a very well publicized issue, but one without immediate effect for most people. Whereas I think that labor in many ways is the opposite of that. It's an issue that we haven't talked a lot about, that there's not a really widespread awareness of, but that has the potential to impact us on a very short-term horizon, because in some regions it's very difficult, like today, to find enough people to pick coffee, and that's impacting the quality of coffee, and it's going to impact the volume of coffee. And this is potentially something that's happening during this harvest, the coffee that we would be drinking in a few months. So, so it's this almost invisible issue that has potentially huge impact in the short-term horizon, and that makes it a really big risk. You've got this convergence of factors where the risk is large, the time horizon is short, and we are not talking about this. So, if anything, this is an issue that we should be talking about a lot, and or the issue that we should be talking about first. But with that, here we are today, and so I won't. I'll leave that as my introduction, and just say thank you, Juan Luis and Quinn, for being here today. And Juan Luis, if I might start with you, if you could just tell us maybe a sentence or two about your farms, and also give us kind of a state of things from your perspective as a farmer. I won't ask you to speak for an entire country or region, but just a little bit of the farm perspective.
Okay, thank you. And first of all, thank you for the invitation, and to be able to at least share at least a little bit of my reality as a farmer. And well, thank everyone for joining in the webinar. And I'll use a little bit of the previous webinar, climate change, and some of that effect, and how it also tends to have an effect also on farm workers. So, for example, in my case, last year, the unevenness of the rainy season had a major impact on my production. My production went down, and then at the same time, that ended up not only giving me lower income, but at the same time, the workers around see that, okay, there's going to be less harvest this year, there's going to be less money, there's going to be less work, so that automatically they start to say, okay, there's not going to be many opportunities. So this year has actually been particularly challenging in obtaining enough farm workers to get the jobs done in a timely manner. And in agriculture, that's one of the keys. I mean, you got to do certain jobs at specific times in the growth of whatever plant you have. Doesn't matter if you're growing tomatoes, growing corn, growing coffee. And if those jobs aren't done, then you start to fall into this sort of like vicious cycle, because then you're not doing jobs on time, then your production is low, then you get less money, and so it's we're not able to get out of it. And one of the consequences also is that instead of this being a virtuous cycle where we can say, okay, this is like a growing and a booming economy where people want to actually compete for jobs because there's going to be a bright future there, is what's happening is the demographics of the workers is also older. The new generations, they're not wanting to work on farms. They're looking for jobs elsewhere, where they feel they're going to have a better future, either longer term or get paid better. So that's where we start to fall into some of these problems. In our farms, where basically we aim specifically towards high quality coffee, where not only are some of the jobs in between the harvests is key, but also the harvesting is key. So we are very strict in our harvesting process, in our picking process, and that requires a certain skill. And for us, it's better if we are having more or less some of the same workers year in and year out, because they already know the quality of coffee that we want to pick, and that is slowly becoming more challenging.
Juan Luis, I love how you just jumped right into the meat of the issue.
Sorry.
Can I ask you to back up just for a second and tell us, like, how big are your farms? How many people do you employ? How much coffee do you produce? You know, for anyone who might not be familiar with your coffee.
Sorry about that. Okay, I manage two farms. They're called La Merced and El Retiro. They're in the area of San Martin, Jilotepeque in Chimaltenango. That's more or less the central part of Guatemala, where if somebody who's familiar with coffees from Guatemala, coffee growing regions, we're about 35 miles north of Antigua. We've been growing, as a family, we've been growing coffee for over 100 years. I'm still harvesting some of the original trees that my grandfather planted back in 1912. We currently have 75 hectares of coffee planted in production, and despite the challenges, I actually do think there is a future in coffee, so I'm actually planting more coffee. So I've already planted an additional 30 over the last couple of years. We are currently producing about 3 containers worth of coffee. This last harvest it did go down a little bit, as I already went ahead and mentioned. Yeah, like I was previously saying, yeah, we are basically focused on high quality coffee. Our coffees, we start growing at 5,750 feet. We go as high as almost 6,300. So we are definitely strictly hard bean coffee.
So how many people would you say that you employ at the peak of the harvest? Like what's the maximum number of people working on your farms? And given that the harvest is about to start, if it hasn't started already, how do you see this year compared to maybe the last few years or the typical year for your farms?
Okay, at peak harvest are usually somewhere between 140 to 150 pickers. Then during in between the harvests, depending on the different jobs we're doing, we'll have peaks of close to 100, especially with the new areas of expansion and planting. Those are very labor intensive. This year's harvest, and I'm knocking on wood here, I'm hoping it will definitely be better than last year's. And at first sight, it looks like we'll be okay with pickers this year. But to be honest with you, until we actually get into the harvest season, which I start around mid-January, I won't really know. So it's that is, we always have a bit of uncertainty with the number of laborers we have, mainly because on my neighbors as the workforce. I mean, I'm surrounded by approximately 1,000 families in the different neighboring communities around the farms, and still that makes it challenging to have labor at times.
Yeah. So Quinn, I'm going to ask the next question to you. So Verité works with or on behalf of workers not just in agriculture but in many different industries around the world. But you've done a lot of work in Guatemala with coffee, both the organization and you in particular. Based on your experience there over the past few years, how do you see the situation in Guatemala? And with that, I'll say the caveat that I think that it's a great opportunity because we do have two people who are familiar with Guatemala here to talk about this issue through that country's lens. But I don't want this to make it sound like, or I'm wary of making it sound like Guatemala is somehow unique in this, because this really is a global sort of issue that we're talking about today.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Verité has done quite a lot of work over 20 years in a number of different sectors. So we started out more in apparel and has moved over to electronics and agriculture more and more. And there's been an increasing focus on raw commodities, so on agricultural goods. And so we started out doing quite a bit of research in the United States among migrant workers, both documented and undocumented, and found a number of issues in that sector. And we did research in, I think it was 2010 through 2013 for the U.S. Department of Labor in Guatemala. And so we did 372 worker interviews. And just this year we just finished doing an additional 450 worker interviews for another project we're doing for Cure Green Mountain, U.S. Department of State. And so my experience in coffee is mostly concentrated in Guatemala. But that said, we've done research in the agricultural sector across a number of countries, and so the findings in Guatemala don't necessarily mean that Guatemala is any better or worse than any other country. Rather, that's where we've started to really do this in-depth research, and it really demonstrates a need to do that kind of research in a number of other countries, because what we find in general in our research is when you begin to talk to workers and you begin to do this type of in-depth research, you generally in the agricultural sector find these types of problems. And so definitely this issue of labor shortages is troubling. As I mentioned, we did research in the U.S. agricultural sector. We found that following immigration crackdowns, there was a major labor shortage, and this caused employers, growers, to have to go through labor brokers in order to recruit workers because they were no longer standing on the corners or outwardly looking for jobs, but they had to go through an intermediary to find workers. And this created a lot of potential for abuse. One issue is that the grower has a certain amount of money to spend, and he has to incorporate into his labor costs the cost of a labor broker, which can be very significant. And secondly, the labor broker generally ends up paying the workers, and so even if the grower is paying well above the minimum wage to the labor broker for each worker, he doesn't have control in many cases of what the worker is actually receiving. And so we've seen the same kind of thing happening in Guatemala, where the more there are labor shortages, the more people, the further from home you have to go. So you're having migrant workers coming from farther away, larger transportation costs, and then the increasing need for labor brokers. And as Juan Luis mentioned, that can create a negative cycle in which wages can go progressively down, the work becomes less and less attractive, and it's harder and harder to find workers. And unless we can stop this cycle and really do more research on farm workers and how to find solutions that are mutually beneficial, we can get into a cycle that's going to be bad for everyone involved.
So you mentioned labor brokers, and I think that is an interesting role to talk about. It's more associated with large farms than small farms, because on small farms, while there are always people employed in some way picking coffee, whether that's formal employment or informal employment, it's larger farms that have the need for more people, more people than you can necessarily find in the surrounding communities, like Juan Luis said. So with that, Juan Luis, what has been your experience with labor brokers?
Well, because I've been surrounded by this number of families in general, my neighbors are the ones who end up showing up to work. This year 2015 was the first time I had to use a labor broker. I've been running the farms for 10 years. First time I had to use a labor broker, and because I needed jobs done, and the people just didn't want to show up to work, or they would say they would show up to work and then they wouldn't. So that makes it even worse. Yeah, that was something I needed to use this year, and it wasn't necessarily a fun experience. It's hard. First of all, because each different farm has its own system, and we want things done a certain way. It's hard to get that sort of like that thinking to the migrant workers who come in. Some of them want to do it their own way, and then when you said no, we need you to do it again because that's not how we asked, and then they said, oh, you know what, then I'll leave. So you also have some of the migrant workers who end up leaving and they don't stay the entire time. You try to give them the best possible facilities that we have, and you still get into a little bit of an issue of, well, that's okay, yeah, they really don't care, and so it wasn't an experience I truly definitely enjoyed, and I'm actually already working on a way to try and change that, because I really don't want to have to refer back to a labor broker. It's not easy because, as Quinn mentioned, there's a certain cost that I need to do my best to try and stay within, or else the farm isn't profitable, and if the farm isn't profitable, then I can't keep reinvesting in the farm, trying to improve quality, improve quantity, while maintaining quality. So it's again, I'm working on, and I'm hoping I can find a solution where it will change a little bit the structure, and that can be used as an example. There are already some farms in Guatemala that are using this system, where basically what you're doing is you're having more full-time employees, and they are managing a certain area, having to do a certain number of jobs, and each farm does it their own way, dealing it with their own reality. So there isn't a cookie cutter approach to that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think,
but I'm hoping.
So there are three things that occurred to me as you're talking, Juan Luis. And the first one of those is that you're already adapting as a farm, or you're kind of constantly adapting your business model to deal with this, and to sort of not, I mean, adaptation is important regardless, but it sounds like you are just constantly recognizing this as a potential risk and trying to come up with solutions just by yourself, like before the coffee even gets to the market and gets to the potential buyer and what the costs are, just trying to figure out, like, how can I work more efficiently, how can I structure my business to be, how can I be creative around this issue, which I think is an important thing for people to recognize, that this isn't like, oh my gosh, we have a problem, buyers fix a problem, or coffee industry fix this problem we have on our farms. This is a constant process of creative adaptation. Another thing that occurs to me as you're talking is just like, the farm is a small business that's trying to invest in people, and the value of being able to hire the same people over and over again, or not having to train new people, and that again gets to the labor broker question that sparked that conversation about how nobody really wants to hire this person. Not that there's anything wrong with the position of the labor broker, but that if you are in that position, it means that you're, depending on someone to find you labor. You're not training the laborers directly yourself. You have less, ultimately, control. You're spending more time in that process, which is inefficient. And then finally, the last thing that I made a note of as you were talking was that relationship, and Quinn mentioned this too, with price, where you have sort of a fixed amount of money that you're working with. And another reason that this issue of farm workers has become so apparent as an issue that we need to be more aware of and spend more time thinking about recently is the low market that we're in. And the market has been volatile. It's the nature of markets to be volatile and unpredictable. So it's not it's no surprise, but I think that's another thing going into the Northern Hemisphere harvest season, thinking, wow, the price has been hovering around 120 for the past couple of months, and what does that mean? How am I going to be able to cover my costs? I know that I may only have this specific amount of money to work with. How am I going to meet all of my needs with that small amount of money? And that gets to a question that just came in on Twitter, so I'll read the question, which is, when discussing with a farmer in Central Huila a few weeks ago, the producer indicated that they are ready to pick and participate in an ambitious processing and lengthy drying process, but the main issue is finding the people to pick. They are all leaving for construction jobs in nearby cities. As a smallholder farmer with 5 hectares, there's not a lot of cash flow. How can we as buyers assist with this issue? Is there anything we can do other than simply offer more money? Is there anything we can glean from other agricultural industries for ideas? Which I think, yeah, there are multiple questions in there, one of which I wanted to ask you, Quinn, about getting ideas from other industries. But, you know, this is, it does get to this, like, price has got to be a piece of it, but how do we, like, what should we be, how should we be thinking about this?
Great. Yeah. So this is an interesting question. And this has been more and more an issue across the agricultural sector. And I think one misnomer is just the idea of unskilled workers, is that agricultural workers being unskilled workers. In fact, it's actually you know, a skill that lots of people learn over many years. And as Juan Luis mentioned, it's not ideal. Just like most of us don't want to use a temp agency. You know, we might do it in a pinch, but we don't want to use it year-round for a large percentage of our workforce. It's really important to have people who are working long term, who have an investment in the finca. It's always better to have a labor force close by. And I think that, you know, this is one of the moments where there's a correlation between what the interests of the coffee sector are and what the interests of workers really are. And I think there's really a need to look at ways that we can develop strategies that improve earnings and conditions for workers, so that coffee becomes more an industry that's as attractive as, or more attractive than, something like construction. And so generally people don't want to migrate. They would rather stay in the communities that their families are in. And so generally it's only when they make a decision based upon significantly increase earnings in another sector that they might leave the agricultural sector or the coffee sector. And so the labor broker issue is one of the ways. You know, if you can cut out the cost that you have to pay to a labor broker and pass all of that on to a worker, that's one way that you can find a situation that might be mutually beneficial. But it can, you know, as Juan Luis mentioned, it can be very difficult when you're in a pinch to do that. And so there have been a number of different ways that people have figured out to use workers. So there's also, for example, the North Carolina Growers Association has begun to pool workers between different farms, because you know, there's different different farms at a different time might have more labor-intensive tasks, and so that's also another thing that you can do. And then you know, we've also worked in areas in which a whole industry association or a group of brands might support farmers or help come up with some of these best practices that work, and everyone getting their heads together, rather than each individual having to really try to experiment with new programs.
I love the shout out to North Carolina, my home state.
Oh yeah.
So what about, you know, we've talked about labor brokers, but I think that question that, and it was Laura Perry who tweeted that at us, but I think that she brings up an interesting example, because it's a smallholder farmer. You know, she mentions that this person only has 5 hectares of coffee. So, and that's an important thing for me to emphasize, or it's important to me to emphasize that, because this is something, again, where we're not just talking about Guatemala, although we happen to have 2 people with more experience in Guatemala than anywhere else on the line. And we're not just talking about large farms who hire labor brokers. You know, this is not an issue that's limited. It's something that everyone really grapples with, and on small farms, sometimes it's compounded by the farm owner being an employer of labor on their farm, but then also potentially an employee on someone else's farm picking coffee when they don't have any to pick, or an employee off the farm in some other sector, as you mentioned. So there's just this really kind of convoluted web of relationships and questions that arise around around labor, and trying to find coffee's space in that is something that is that can be tricky when it is one of those sort of situations where the line between employer and employee isn't as defined, and maybe there's income coming in not just from coffee but from the sale of other products or from some sort of off-farm income being generated. And I wonder, Quinn, when Laura asks, are there other sectors that we should be, or other agricultural industries we could be learning from? Is anyone doing this well? Because I have the sense that people like cocoa have had some major labor issues, and we're probably mostly around child labor, or most visibly around child labor. But is anyone really doing a good job with this? Like, can coffee learn lessons from anyone here?
Sure. So, ironically, the tobacco industry is actually one of the leaders in labor issues, specifically Philip Morris. And coffee has, I guess, more in common than tobacco than you would think. First, of course, it's addictive and makes your teeth brown. And secondly, it's also the brand identity of companies that work in tobacco are very linked to the product, just as coffee companies are very linked to coffee. So there are a few other brands that generally focus on one specific commodity. And so with Philip Morris, basically in 2010, there was a big expose by Human Rights Watch about child labor on farms in Kazakhstan. And so based upon that, we started working with Philip Morris to develop an agricultural labor practices, or ALP standards, and we've implemented those standards in over 30 countries now, and more than 500,000 farms. And basically, through the Philip Morris program, what we try to do is we work both with the growers themselves to determine what their needs are, and with the workers, because we realize that we can't try to get growers to implement policies that aren't going to function, right? That aren't going to allow them to turn a profit. And so if we set up a call-in line, for example, that call-in line will be available to workers and will be available to growers, and growers can also voice their concerns about how things might not be working. And as a result of that project, for example, in Kazakhstan in 2013, tobacco in Kazakhstan was one of the two goods that was removed from the DOL's list of goods made with child labor. And we've done work in the U.S. agricultural sector that discussion I said about the North Carolina Growers Association. We've also been working with Philip Morris in the U.S. as well, trying to help them help farmers with labor shortages, with looking at alternatives, with looking at ways to improve conditions of work, and also improve incomes for the growers themselves. And so they've also invested, for example, Philip Morris in technology for cutting tobacco that it makes it safer for children, so that they don't have to actually be involved in the topping of tobacco, and also is much more efficient, allowing the growers to turn better profits. And so I think that those kinds of engagements across countries, and using lessons learned, and also developing, for each country, specific programs that depend on the country context is really important.
Yeah, that is interesting. Coffee and tobacco.
Yeah.
Another thing that strikes me as you're talking is this idea that it's something, or it's work that Verité is doing, but with both producers and workers. Quinn, can you mute your microphone? I think there's some feedback coming from your side. Thank you. So that it's something that's done as a whole supply chain, or whole value chain together, because, as you mentioned, there's some brand risk here, for companies that are so closely associated with their product. McDonald's is a very visible brand, and maybe hamburgers, are the thing that they're most known for, but they serve a lot of different food products at McDonald's, and there are a lot of ingredients that go into that, whereas a coffee company may serve many different things in its coffee shop, but really it's most identifiable with coffee, and coffee is a single ingredient beverage, or the two ingredient, I shouldn't discount water of all people, But it's coffee and water that's going into this. So you are really tied to the kind of identity of that one food, that one agricultural commodity, or that one agricultural product, in a way that many other companies wouldn't be so closely aligned with one thing. So with that, there's more kind of responsibility and scrutiny potentially of a coffee company for its coffee sourcing practices than another company for its sourcing practices. And but when we talk about this, and especially talking about it from the position of a coffee drinker or a coffee buyer in the United States, I think it is also important for us to recognize that this isn't something that we can do on behalf of farmers and farm workers, or this isn't something that we are doing to protect our brands, but rather to really ensure the viability of the product at every stage, and that needs to include the voices of everyone. And that leads me to another question that we got from over Twitter, and this one's for Juan Luis, from Miguel Zamora. From a farmer's perspective, what could industry specifically do to improve the labor shortages situation in coffee?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, and I think this is a perfect example of something that industry is trying to do. First of all, is get the topic out there, get it discussed, share some of these experiences. Like Quinn mentioned, also hear about labor experiences from other industries, because I think there's a lot of learning that can be done from that. So I think this is an important step. But in the comment, of coming from Colombia, it's also a reality. The sense that working on farms, and it doesn't matter even if it's coffee, tobacco, or anything else, it's hard labor. I mean, it's physically challenging, and we also want the farm workers to have more dignified lives. In the case of Guatemala, we've got a minimum wage that every year goes up 5%. We already know about it. We have to factor that in. And that's sort of government's way of trying to improve this. But seriously, as an industry and going forward, if we really don't want to run into true, really labor shortages where, we're going to be like, all right, what am I going to do with the coffee? What am I going to do with these coffee trees? Is, yes, being able to hopefully try to increase the wages so that it's well above the minimum wage, where it actually becomes attractive to say, oh, you know what? Yeah, I want to go work on a coffee farm. Why? Because it's a long-term product. We know once we planted coffee, it's going to be there for a while, and this is something I can sort of specialize in. But as a worker, you also want to see where am I going to get the best bang for my time. And I think that, again, as an industry, despite the volatility, we need to try and see if volatility in prices, we need to see if we can start to try and increase the income to the farmers. And it doesn't matter if you're 5 hectare or a large farmer. If we're not able to eventually start to raise the average price for coffee, it's going to be hard to be able to trickle that down to the farm workers. We can try and do and be more efficient as we possibly can, and definitely try to increase our productivity, because that's also going to help lower our costs. But there's still going to be a point where, all right, we can only go so far, and I think as an industry we need to find other mechanisms for coffee in general. Specialty coffee, if you're already selling specialty coffee, direct trade, relationship coffee, where you're talking about fixed prices well above the C contract, where essentially you sit down and talk with, in the case of me as a grower, I sit down and talk with with the roasters who are buying from me and saying, hey, you know, this is more or less the price I need in order to be able to, you know, pay well, reinvest in the farm, you know, keep up productivity, keep up quality. That's good, but we're really only a very small portion of the coffee market, and I think industry-wise, it's something it's going to have to happen if we want coffee to be around. The other thing, which is something that some governments understand, some don't, and I'm not sure if as a global industry we get it, but coffee is really a major source of employment. I mean, we do occupy a lot of people, and you know, if we're able to, you know, somehow, you know, find solutions collectively that are, you know, win-win for everybody along the value chain, from the farm worker all the way to the barista who's serving the coffee. The impact we can actually have on development is really huge, and I think that's something we, as an industry, sometimes we lose a little bit of sight on, and you know, I think that's something that with events like this one, we start to have this discussion, start to get the topic out, and, you know, get, you know, more brains around thinking around this topic.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned baristas in this, and there was a lecture at the SCAA event a couple of years ago about farm workers, and the title of it was "Millions on the Margin," which I think is a pretty apt and a poignant way of describing this huge group of people that is really fundamental to coffee production. You know, because it's the first moment, the first stage in this coffee supply chain, who we're just not really seeing, or if we're seeing them, not recognizing their importance and the value of this to what we do, especially in specialty, where it isn't just a matter of getting the coffee off the tree. You know, it's about doing it in the right way, at the right time, to our specifications, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And although the comparison is not a perfect one, I do think that using the barista and sort of learning, or maybe knowing our history when it comes to the role of the barista is useful, because a decade or two ago, I would say that the role of the barista was not recognized at all. And although we have some way to go before that is a career option for every barista with benefits and a living wage, and there's a lot of work still to be done, I think that as an industry and as you know, as a society, we have begun to see that person and see their role, and to see the skill that that goes into making good coffee good, and the importance of the barista in that. And so, you know, this idea that the person at the very beginning of the chain could be likewise valued and likewise recognized, and that by doing that, by sort of beginning to acknowledge and value that person and that work, we can begin to kind of, and it'll be a slow process, but elevate that and make the work more appealing, make it more more rewarding, and ultimately then increase the competitiveness of coffee, which these days, as noted in the case of Colombia, it's becoming you know, less and less competitive. Another tweet that came in was the factor to consider the work concerns of long-term safety from agriculture chemical exposure, which again I think speaks to just both the points that both of you have made, Quinn and Juan Luis, about coffee picking being hard, you know, or farming labor in general, not just picking coffee, but working in agriculture is difficult, and that's coffee as well as everything else. You know, I think that in specialty and maybe in coffee in general, we've wanted to romanticize the you know, the beauty of coffee farms and the you know, the romance of quality and unique coffees from special producers in amazing places. And in doing that, we have done ourselves many great services, but maybe a bit of a disservice in painting a picture of this like a small farm with old trees and low productivity and very rustic conditions as somehow a romantic ideal, and that's not a life that most people really would want for themselves or for anyone else when it comes to things like thinking about the profitability of a farm or the ability of the farm to continue and the farmer and the family and the community to thrive into the future. Quinn, it looks like you're about to say something.
Oh yeah, sorry, muted again. Yeah, in terms of this the comment about chemical exposure, also, I think that another way that workers can feel valued and can feel like their interests are being taken into account, and to prevent that kind of chemical exposure is around training around the use of chemicals, and so that's another way that resources can be pooled, that trainings can be developed, and that can be implemented across different fincas, especially if there's some kind of brand involvement or some kind of industry association involvement. Those types of trainings and those materials can be passed on, really at zero to very small amount of cost to the growers themselves, and that again helps to improve the livelihoods of farmers and make them feel more valued and like their interests are being taken into account, and something that can be done, relatively cheaply.
Juan Luis, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, again, it's something I referred to. Quinn again just mentioned it. It's yeah, the less rotation of personnel you have, the more a lot of these issues are going to be dealt with well. Why? Because I mean, once you can do the training to the same people, make sure that whatever safety risks, health risks, are contemplated or taken into account. In Guatemala, there's an association that they work and give these trainings free of charge to coffee farms. So that's something that at least we have at our disposal here, and I'm sure that there's other organizations similar to that in different parts of the world. But it ends up being sort of costly and redundant if you're. It's like, okay, now we have to go through this again. You're again taking time. You're using resources, and the more stable a labor force we can have, the better everybody's worker all the way to.
I feel like we might have missed a little bit of you broke up a little bit on my end, Juan Luis, but I think that what you were saying was the more stable a workforce you can have, the better you are as a farm, and the better off subsequently everyone is in the coffee supply chain because of this. So we have about 10 minutes left, and we've gotten some good questions from Twitter, and I will I'm going to try asking a question of those of you who are listening out there, or anyone who has been involved in this, who has done kind of thinking about this, if you have any experiences that you think would be, that are good models for this, or good examples of either a farm recognizing this and implementing some sort of measure to address it, or a farm and a buyer and farm workers working together. I think that that we would all benefit from learning a little bit from each other here too, because this is an issue that can be a little bit tricky to talk about, I think, for some people. Farmers don't want to necessarily admit when it's a challenge because it could potentially call their quality into question. Like, why is it that you can't, why can't you keep people, or is it that you're not paying them enough? I can put a farmer in a defensive position to bring this up. Likewise, with a buyer, I think that there's a lot of hesitancy around recognizing that there might be an issue because it brings up like, well, maybe we're not paying enough, and if we're not paying this farm enough, and we can't really afford to pay more right now, then what does it mean about our relationship or about the sustainability of our business? And because it's about people, and about this very sort of fundamental thing that, at least for many people listening who I imagine live in the United States, just take for granted that minimum wage is something that you personally don't have to worry about if you go to the grocery store, whether or not the person who bags your groceries is being paid minimum wage. That's not something that you feel the need to quiz the grocery store manager about. Now, whether or not we should be doing that, that's a whole other can of worms for a different webinar that's not specific to coffee. But because I think that there's a hesitancy to recognize what we don't know, I think people have been hesitant also to stand up and say, this is what I'm doing and it's working, or this is what I would like to be doing, but I'm afraid that my customers won't want to pay more for the coffee. So I'm curious if, just to ask out there in the ether, if anyone has any experiences to share. I know that we would also be, we would like to hear those. But anyway, while I was giving you that little monologue, we got another question, which was, should companies draft and enforce labor contracts or minimums in parts of their supply chain where governments fail to do so? Quinn, what do you think about that?
Right. So I do think that generally having codes of conduct and enforcing those codes of conduct is really important. And part of that is communicating what the expectations are, ensuring that the growers themselves have the resources to do so, and that they're provided with any tools. And so they mentioned labor contracts. We've developed, for example, sample contracts that can be adapted and provided to workers. A lot of times, again, when there's some kind of intermediary in the middle, a worker, the conditions originally promised may differ substantially from the actual conditions of work, which can result in a lack of satisfaction on the job. So it is really important that that workers be provided with very in-depth information about what they're going to be expected to do, and what the remuneration is, and what deductions will be, and also part of that is also understanding the whole supply chain. A lot of times it's hard for companies to really know where their coffee ultimately comes from. If they don't know where the coffee ultimately comes from, it's hard to even communicate their expectations to the farms that they ultimately buy that coffee from. So part of it is also supply chain mapping, and then following up with those suppliers and having constructive conversations again about what the challenges are, having open communication with all the suppliers, rather than hiding things, bringing things out into the open. And generally, the most successful projects that we've done are where we don't put unrealistic expectations on growers, but rather move towards a goal and ensure that we're all moving steadily towards that goal, but have clear expectations, a clear goal, and figure out ways that we can create these types of mutually beneficial solutions. And I saw this next question also was about whether creating more winter or full-time work is a way to do that. And so we actually found in that Guatemala study of the 372 workers interviewed, we found both that temporary workers earned about 79% of the wages of permanent workers, and that workers recruited by labor brokers earned about 75% of the wages of workers who are directly employed by the fincas. And again, generally that's because of this cost of training, because of the cost of transporting workers who might be migrant workers. It's the cost of paying those labor brokers. And so I think that the type of experiment that Juan Luis is doing, where you offer workers more full-time work, I think they become more invested in the company itself, like any full-time worker would be, and they also become more satisfied and have a stable source of employment year-round, rather than moving between different sectors. So I think that is one of the ways we could look at one of the solutions that we could look at for this sector.
Quinn, you're trying to do my job for me. So my the next question that we got was from Andy Newbaum, asking or acknowledging that farm worker the farm worker issue can be a seasonal problem on farms, exacerbated during the height of the harvest, and is a solution to create more full-time jobs, more winter workers, more bodies of more sort of organized bodies of farm workers. And Juan Luis, you spoke to this a second ago or a few minutes ago with your sort of new strategy for the farm this year. But what do you think about that that idea? Do you think that that is a solution? Is fewer jobs but more stability in those jobs?
Yeah, again, that's more or less the model I'm going to try and implement, and again, I'm hoping it will have a solution. The challenge also becomes on the cost end, because there are a few months where there isn't a whole lot of actual work that needs to be done. So again, if it's a full-time employee year-round, then you sort of have to end up balancing that cost for when times there's no job being done or very little, which during those months you could probably use a temporary employee and pay, and your cost would be much less. So that's where the challenge is. Excellent. If you're a farm, doesn't matter how big of a farm you are. If you have multiple products on that farm, then okay, then you can use the full-time employees to go do other jobs. Excellent. But if you don't, if basically all you have is coffee, then that becomes one of the challenges. And I think that's part of the experimentation that's going on. That's part of some of the challenges that we're looking for. And most importantly, as Quinn mentioned, answering the previous question, it's to make sure if it's something coming in from a roaster or a buyer requesting, listen, we want to make sure you're complying with the labor laws, et cetera, et cetera. Make sure it's a dialogue and it's in a collaborative environment, and it's not coming down as, oh, you know what, this is something else we want you to comply with because it's important and you have to do it. Because in that sense, what would most likely happen is you'd get a lot of pushback and saying, oh, okay, all right, you know what, maybe I'll go try and find somebody else who's willing to actually work with me in a more collaborative way. So that would be just basically my message to roasters and buyers who feel, all right, this is an important topic for them. Then yeah, please have that open dialogue with your suppliers, with your producers, to make sure you can together hopefully try and find solutions.
And I think that's a good note. We're at about the end of our time together to end on, which is that this is and Juan Luis, you said this well earlier, that one of the things that we need to do here is just continue to raise awareness and have more dialogue around this issue, and to do that collaboratively. So I think that large and small buyers have different entry points here. You can get different toeholds into this. Large buyers have a very large sphere of influence in as much as they have a lot of volume. But that might also mean that there's not a lot of traceability. And Quinn, you kind of alluded to this, that you don't necessarily know all of your suppliers, and not all of your coffee is traceable. So you might be able to affect change pretty quickly with a supplier if you're their major buyer. But that might only represent a small percentage of the overall coffee supply that you deal with as a company. A small buyer may be in the opposite situation, where they have very little direct or very little volume that they're dealing with, but all of their coffee is traceable because they buy small quantities through importers that have built their brands on traceability. So it will be easier to get that basic information than it would be for a large buyer. So everyone has some access here. It's it's not going to be an easy thing, but everyone's got a place to start, and asking these questions and beginning to have these conversations and framing them that way as conversations and opportunities to learn and try to do better and be a leader here. I think that this is an area where global agriculture has a problem, and global production of everything has a problem, because I think we tend to discount the true cost of labor. So we're not alone in this in coffee, but that doesn't excuse us either, and we can do better. So that is our commitment is to do that. So I think I might have actually just lost Quinn off the line, which makes me sad. But maybe he'll catch the video and see me thank him. Thank you, Quinn, and thank you, Juan Luis, for your time today. This will stream live or live on the SCAA YouTube channel. And I hope that everyone watching enjoyed our discussion. Thank you for your questions, and join us again next month for our next critical issue webinar discussion.
Thank you.